They said the sale was routine, just another transaction in Charleston's slave market, April of 1847. But when archivists decades later unsealed the record, they found the handwriting altered, the gender designation changed in a different ink, and the buyer's signature traced, as if rewritten by someone's trembling hand. That single page bound in leather and dust was supposed to represent property. Instead, it became evidence of something else, a story so impossible it was buried beneath false names, sealed reports, and family shame. 8 months later, the master who signed that document would discover that the female slave he purchased wasn't who, or what, she appeared to be. And when his wife's belly began to swell with life that could not have come from him, the Riverwood Plantation fell into silence, the kind that follows the discovery of a secret older than law, older than race, older than flesh itself. This isn't folklore. Every detail comes from surviving testimony, coded letters, and a physician-sealed confession that vanished from the Hanover County archives in 1852. Tonight, we're opening what was never meant to be opened, the true story of the Riverwood transaction. Keep listening, but understand, once you hear it, you'll never unsee it. Riverwood Plantation stood like a monument to Southern order, 800 acres of tobacco fields and human obedience. But its master, Isaiah Vanderhorst, carried ghosts behind his polished veneer. Since his first wife's death, something inside him had hollowed out. He moved through his mansion like a revenant, enforcing structure to silence the disorder inside himself. When he remarried, it wasn't for love. It was for legacy, a wife to bear children, a servant to manage her. An estate to preserve his name. That was all. So when his brother Thomas returned from Charleston with the purchase, a quiet girl named Grace, Isaiah didn't look twice. The bill of sale said a female, 17, literate, trained in domestic service. What he saw was obedience, small, pale, deliberate. But Patience, his old housekeeper, saw something else, the way Grace's shoulders carried tension beneath stillness, the way her gaze never lingered too long. It wasn't the fear of bondage, it was the fear of exposure. That first night, thunder pressed against the windows. Catherine, Isaiah's new wife, heard footsteps pacing the attic above her, slow, measured, almost like counting. She assumed it was a restless servant, but Grace wasn't pacing. She was binding herself, preparing her disguise, reconstructing the lie her mother had built to keep her alive. By morning, Riverwood's routines had already absorbed her. Grace rose before dawn, silent among the others, her movements calculated, her breath shallow beneath the bandages that flattened her chest. She knew the rhythm of servitude, when to vanish, when to appear, how to make herself invisible while always being useful. But in the eyes of Catherine Vanderhorst, her new mistress, invisibility was a language of its own. Catherine had been raised to endure, not to live, a wife chosen for lineage, not affection. When she first met Grace, she sensed something different. A stillness that mirrored her own, but sharper, watchful, as though the girl carried a secret too dangerous to speak. Catherine tested her. The hairdressing, the wardrobe, the small, obedient replies. Everything was proper, everything rehearsed. And yet, when Grace touched her hair, Catherine felt a tremor, not of fear, but of energy, as if two imprisoned souls had found the same frequency. At night, Catherine lay awake, hearing Isaiah's heavy steps fade down the hall after his mechanical visits. She'd stare at the ceiling and wonder why her skin burned when Grace brushed past her during the day. There was no sin in it, not yet. Only the recognition of something forbidden, two mirrors reflecting each other in a house built entirely on lies. By late May of 1847, the air in Hanover County hung heavy with heat and secrets. Catherine found herself drawn to Grace's presence in ways she couldn't name without fear. There was an intelligence behind the girl's quiet, something self-contained, disciplined. One morning, Catherine discovered Grace reading from a Bible in the parlor. Not the recited verses most slaves memorized, but passages about transformation, rebirth, and hidden identity. When asked who taught her, Grace simply said, "My mother, mistress." She said truth can't be owned, only carried. That answer unsettled Catherine more than she cared to admit, because she too carried truths she'd buried, her resentment toward Isaiah, her loneliness, her quiet disgust at the system she was trapped inside, but powerless to resist. Grace became her confidant without ever asking for the role. Their silences spoke more than their words, but downstairs the housekeeper Patience watched them closely. She'd lived long enough to sense when two forces began to move toward collision. She'd seen it before. how obsession could infect a plantation like rot in the walls. And late one evening, as she passed Catherine's door, she heard a whisper through the wood. Not words, just breathing. Two patterns, uneven, entwined. Something had crossed an invisible line at Riverwood, and nothing from that moment would move in innocence again. The shift began quietly, a touch that lingered too long, a question asked too softly. Catherine's loneliness had found its echo in Grace, and what began as duty transformed into fascination. Catherine started inventing tasks that required Grace's presence, fittings that lasted until midnight, embroidery lessons that required the brush of hands. It wasn't lust at first, it was curiosity, an ache to feel something real in a world built on performance. Grace, for her part, responded with a strange restraint. She didn't flirt, she didn't resist. She simply allowed Catherine's nearness, as if she understood the power of being seen but not seized. Yet beneath her quiet eyes burned another truth, one that could end them both. Every moment of intimacy tightened the noose around her secret. The bindings beneath her dress grew more painful, the concealment harder to maintain. Isaiah noticed. He said nothing, but he watched his wife's posture change, her tone soften when she spoke to the servant. It stirred something old and bitter inside him, the humiliation of not being chosen. That night, he dreamed of his dead wife, Sarah, whispering from her untouched bedroom, "You don't own what you think you do." When he awoke, he found Catherine's bed empty and footsteps leading toward the attic. The attic was where the house breathed, where its secrets collected in dust and silence. Isaiah climbed the narrow stairs without lighting a lamp. The boards creaked beneath his weight, and for a moment he heard voices, soft, low, indistinct. Then the scrape of a chair. When he pushed open the door, only Grace stood there, her dress hastily straightened, her breathing shallow. Catherine's shawl lay folded on the trunk beside her. "Where is my wife?" he asked. His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp as razors. "She was cold, master," Grace said quietly. "Vi brought her here to see the sky through the eaves." Isaiah stepped closer. The air between them felt charged, something invisible but undeniable. His gaze lingered too long. For the first time, he saw the faint tension beneath her clothing, the way her chest didn't move when she breathed. He said nothing. He simply turned and descended the stairs, his mind flickering between suspicion and disgust, fear and desire. That night, he ordered patience to dismiss Grace from house duties and reassign her to laundry work in the rear quarters. Catherine objected, but he silenced her with a single look, the kind of look that ends arguments, marriages, and illusions of power. But exile didn't stop the gravity pulling them together. It only pulled them deeper, toward the discovery that would shatter every name in the Riverwood record. Weeks passed, and Riverwood fell into a strange rhythm of repression. Isaiah buried himself in fieldwork, riding from dawn until dusk, trying to outdistance something he couldn't name. Catherine withdrew into silence, her eyes hollow but alive with the kind of defiance that comes only from forbidden memory. And Grace, she moved like a shadow between the spaces of the house, unseen but always felt. Then came June. The air turned heavy and Catherine's body began to change. At first she thought it exhaustion, faint spells, a quickened pulse, a tenderness that felt unnatural. But when the sickness came each morning, denial became impossible. She told no one, not even Dinah. Only Grace noticed, the tremor in her hands, the pallor of her skin. In the stillness of the linen room, Catherine whispered, "Grace's hands froze mid-fold." Grace's hands froze mid-fold. For a moment, the mask cracked, not with fear but with something deeper, older, almost reverent. "Then it has begun," she said softly. Catherine stared at her. "What do you mean?" But Grace didn't answer. She turned away, eyes glinting with a secret she'd carried her whole life, one not born of desire, but of design. That night, the wind rose again, and with it, the sound of a woman sobbing where no one stood. By July, the rumor had begun to seep through the quarters. The mistress is with child. Normally, that would have been a cause for celebration at Riverwood. But the house was silent. Isaiah spoke to no one about it. Catherine's health declined, her moods shifting between fever and despair. And Grace was nowhere to be seen after sundown. Patience, the old housekeeper, was the first to notice what others ignored. The way the dogs whined whenever Grace passed, the way mirrors fogged behind her reflection, the way Catherine's pregnancy advanced too quickly. It was unnatural. By the third month, she appeared nearly 6. One humid evening, Patience found Catherine collapsed beside the washtub. Grace knelt over her, whispering words not from any scripture Patience knew. syllables shaped like prayer but vibrating with something else entirely. When she caught sight of the old woman, Grace fell silent, eyes dark and steady. "A child," Patience said, voice trembling. "What are you?" Grace stood slowly. "What your kind made me," she whispered. "Half blood of your sin and theirs, half ghost of a truth you buried." Catherine moaned, clutching her swollen stomach. A faint light, pale and flickering, pulsed beneath her skin, and for the first time in her long years at Riverwood, Patience turned and fled. The next morning the house felt colder, though the Virginia summer blazed outside. Isaiah sat at the head of the breakfast table, untouched coffee cooling before him. Catherine had not come down. Grace was missing. And in the silence between the clock's ticks, something inside him began to rot. Patience refused to speak of what she'd seen the night before, but her shaking hands betrayed her. She kept crossing herself in secret, muttering, "It ain't natural, Lord. Lord, it ain't natural." When Isaiah finally stormed into the quarters, demanding answers, no one would meet his gaze, until one old field hand said quietly, "She don't bleed like a woman, sir." The words hit him like a gunshot. He said nothing, only turned and walked toward the laundry shed where Grace slept. The door creaked open under his hand. Inside, the bindings lay folded on a stool. Torn fabric, a basin of bloody water. Then he saw them, Catherine's letters. Dozens hidden beneath the cot, each one written in the same delicate script, but addressed to no one, just initials. G.V. He picked one up. The ink was smudged, but the words clear enough to freeze his heart. If they knew who you truly are, they'd burn us both. Isaiah locked himself in his study until dusk, reading the letters one by one. At first, they were innocent, reflections, gratitude, the tenderness of companionship. But as the months went on, the language shifted. Catherine wrote of visions in her sleep, of rivers running backward, of children born with the wrong eyes, of a face that was both hers and not hers. Grace had told her things no one could have known. Dates of deaths that hadn't yet occurred. The name of Isaiah's first wife before she'd married him. The exact night the old overseer would hang himself behind the smokehouse. When the final letter ended, Isaiah's hands trembled. She said she isn't a woman, not anymore, not since Charleston, not since the experiment. He stumbled back, heart hammering. Charleston, the city where the bill of sale had been forged, the one his brother Thomas had signed. Isaiah remembered the ink that looked wrong, the way the clerk avoided his eyes. It wasn't a purchase, it was a transfer. Something born from a doctor's failed creation. A body remade in secret, flesh stitched to purpose. He rose, rage and terror bleeding into one thought. What have I brought into my house? Upstairs, Catherine screamed. The scream tore through the house like lightning splitting an oak. By the time Isaiah reached the upper landing, servants were already gathered below, frozen in terror. He burst into the master bedroom and stopped cold. Catherine lay on the floor, her dress soaked in blood, her belly convulsing as if something inside fought to break free. Grace knelt beside her, whispering in a voice that no longer sounded human. "Don't touch her," she hissed when Isaiah lunged forward. Her eyes, once soft, now gleamed like polished iron. "What have you done to her?" he roared. Grace lifted her head slowly. "You did this," she said. "When you bought what you didn't understand, when your kind began to breed bodies to study, not to save. She carries what you made." Catherine's screams broke into sobs. The air grew thick, charged, the candle flames stretching long and thin. A shape pressed beneath her skin, small hands, a face trying to form. Then silence. Catherine's chest stopped rising. Grace looked down at her, eyes glistening. "It wasn't meant to survive," she whispered. "And none of us were." Isaiah staggered back, reaching for the pistol on the dresser. But when he raised it, Grace was gone, vanished into the corridor, leaving only blood and the faint sound of something breathing where Catherine's body had been. The house fell into nightmare. Servants fled into the woods before dawn, swearing the walls whispered Catherine's name. Isaiah sealed the upper floors, but he could still hear movement, faint footsteps pacing above the locked door, the creak of boards bending under weight. On the second night, he went back, not out of courage, but desperation. Catherine's body lay exactly where he'd left it, except now it wasn't alone. The shape beside her was small, fragile, and breathing. The child, if it could be called that, had eyes open wide, black as coal, and skin the color of ash. It didn't cry. It only watched him, silent and still, as if judging the man who made its existence possible. Grace emerged from the corner, her dress torn, her face streaked with soot. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. Isaiah raised the pistol. What is that thing? Grace's voice trembled. A child born without permission. Part of me. Part of what your brother paid for. Isaiah's hand shook. You're lying. No, she said. He called it salvation. A way to cross what God divided. The creature moved then, not crawling but unfolding, its limbs bent wrong. Its breath came in two tones, one high, one low, like two beings breathing through one throat. Isaiah dropped the gun, and in that moment, the Riverwood lineage died forever. Isaiah stumbled backward, choking on air thick with rot and candle smoke. The thing, his child, his punishment, moved toward him with slow, deliberate grace. Grace followed behind it, not as its mother but as its keeper. Her face carried no fear, only sorrow. You wanted dominion, she said. You wanted to own blood, to define creation itself. Now behold what obedience to pride has borne. Isaiah tried to speak, but his voice broke into a whisper. What are you? Grace knelt beside the child. Once, she said, I was a woman. Then I became an experiment. They tried to rewrite what divides us, male from female, white from black, master from slave. They wanted a vessel without history. Her hand trembled as she brushed the creature's cheek. But you can't erase what was done in blood. It remembers. Isaiah's sanity began to fray. The faces in the portraits around the room seemed to shift, the eyes of his ancestors turning away from him. God forgive me, he muttered, staggering toward the hall. Grace looked up. He won't, not for this. Then the child opened its mouth. The sound that came out wasn't a cry, it was a voice. Catherine's voice whispering his name. That was when Isaiah finally ran. Isaiah fled through the corridors like a man pursued by judgment itself. The mansion that once stood as a symbol of order now pulsed with madness, wallpaper shifting like breathing skin, candle flames bending backward, portraits warping into the faces of those he'd enslaved. Every door he opened led him not to escape, but back toward the same hallway, the same locked attic door where it had all begun. Behind it, Grace sang softly, a lullaby without words, low and haunting. Between each verse came the child's voice, sometimes Catherine's tone, sometimes his own, sometimes something older, inhuman. He slammed his fists against the wood. End it, he shouted. Whatever you are, end it. The song stopped. Then Grace's voice came, calm and cold. It will end when men stop pretending they are God. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the cradle sat in the center of the room. Empty, Grace stood at the window, her bindings gone, her body luminous beneath the stormlight. Isaiah raised his pistol once more, but before he could pull the trigger, the floor beneath him cracked as if the house itself rejected him. He fell backward down the stairs, neck snapping with a sound that silenced Riverwood for good. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving Riverwood drenched in the smell of wet timber and decay. The servants returned cautiously, drawn by silence. They found Isaiah's body twisted at the foot of the grand staircase, his face pale, eyes wide open, as if still watching something only he could see. The pistol lay beside him, unfired. Upstairs, Catherine's room was empty. No body, no child, no Grace, only the faint impression of two sets of footprints leading toward the open window and a smear of blood shaped like a handprint on the sill. For days, no one dared enter again. When the county constable arrived, he ordered the place sealed, calling it a matter for the family. But there was no family left. Thomas Vanderhorst, the brother who'd arranged the purchase, was found hanged in his Charleston study 2 weeks later, a letter pinned to his chest with a sewing needle. It read, "We called it grace because it defied the grave, but we never asked if what we made deserved to live. The plantation went to ruin within a year. By winter, the house had begun to sink into the earth, as if the land itself wanted to forget. But not everything buried stays dead. They say Riverwood still stands, though no road leads to it now. The fields have swallowed the fences, the well runs black, and the main house sits half-sunken beneath vines that move when the wind doesn't. Hunters who've strayed too close speak of a light in the attic window, faint and pulsing, like a heartbeat trying to remember itself. Others claim to hear a woman's voice humming a song that makes the air taste like iron. In 1903, a county surveyor digging near the ruins uncovered a sealed jar wrapped in rotted linen. Inside was the final Riverwood ledger, and one additional entry written in the same altered hand as the 1847 bill of sale. It read only, "A returned, not sold." No one could trace who wrote it. The handwriting didn't match any Vanderhorst, any overseer, or any clerk of record. But beneath that line, pressed faintly into the parchment, were two perfect imprints, small, human, and identical. Some say Grace escaped. Others say she was never human to begin with. But the truth hides between both, something born of cruelty, faith, and forbidden knowledge that refused to die. And if you ever stand in Hanover soil on a windless night, listen closely. You might still hear a cradle rocking in the dark, waiting for the world to admit what it created. End of the Riverwood transaction, 1847.